Graham, you just attended something exciting. What is it?
Yeah, so last week in Vancouver was something called Node Interactive, and I thought I would just share what I learned from the conference with our viewers, and just let them know what I saw and what I found interesting, and how it might apply to us in the collaboration communities. Just really quickly, who am I? So I think everybody knows who I am, but I am Graham Akers, Brytech Systems business partner in Vancouver, and was fortunate to be named an IBM champion this year. And you know, I'm active cycling and cooking and growing stuff, and used to be active doing hockey things. That's enough about me. So the agenda, what do we want to talk about today? We'll try and keep this short and sweet.
Can I tell them who I am? Is that okay?
Yes, absolutely. Why don't you go ahead?
I'm just Colin. Colin Breckles with Castlebrec, fellow C3UG member, and IBM champion for 2017. But it's all about you and your Node Interactive, so let's roll.
Okay, so our agenda. What is Node Interactive? So I'll just give a quick update of what that is, or an explanation of what that is for people who might not know, and then explain why I attended. Talk about some of the people that I met, and certainly some of the content that I saw, and some of the key takeaways that I just found interesting. So what is Node Interactive? Node Interactive is, for those of us in the ICS community, the equivalent of Lotusphere for people who work with NodeJS as a technology. So it's a conference, and why don't I explain a little bit more here with the words. What is Node Interactive? So an annual conference based on Node. Interestingly enough, they went out of their way to say that this was a vendor-neutral conference. Interestingly enough, IBM was a major sponsor, Google was a major sponsor, Microsoft was a sponsor, and they all were kind of lined up together. There were talks that talked about all of the different cloud offerings that they have, including Amazon Web Services, and more or less all of them were kind of considered equals. And they were very friendly towards one another too. So of course, for those of us that might have been old school Lotus Notes people, we know of some of the, let's say, competitive nature between Microsoft and IBM. There was none of that to be seen here. Everybody was kind of having fun and hanging out together, and how can we work together? So that was really quite interesting. The conference itself is sponsored by the Node.js Foundation, and not necessarily co-sponsored, but supported by the Linux Foundation as well. Of course, Node being open source and vendor neutral, there wasn't necessarily a lot of money coming out of the Node world per se to put the conference on. So the foundation was a major funder, and of course the sponsors did a lot to help out too. 3 days, it had technical presentations and workshops on the first 2 days. On the third day, there were no technical presentations. It was all about workshops and something they call Code and Learn, which was really quite cool, at least in terms of a concept. I didn't go to the third day, but I definitely did a bunch of the technical presentations and interacted with a lot of the people. This was the third such conference. The first one was in Portland. The second one was in Austin last year, this year Vancouver. And they've announced that next year is going to be in Vancouver as well. So Canadians who are interested in Node and what Node does, certainly plan for, I think it's October, something like the 10th to the 12th next year, right here in Vancouver.
That's pretty cool. So 2 years in a row, huh?
Yeah, you know, and I think they were kind of blessed because the weather was spectacular, and it was at the Vancouver Convention Center, which I haven't been to. It's the convention center's been around for a couple of years, so it was my first opportunity to see that space, which was really beautiful. And it's right on the waterfront, so we're overlooking the mountains and the water, and there were float planes coming in and out, and everybody was just absolutely gaga over it. Not a cloud in the sky, which is very un-Vancouver-like. So the city did its best to absolutely shine for the conference, and I think that helped convince them that they want to come back again next year.
Well, how cool for you that it's in Vancouver.
Well, and this was part of what I was going to talk about. I didn't even actually know about the conference until the week before. I happened to be working on a project, and we jumped onto the Node webpage, to download some code, and there it said Node Interactive in Vancouver, and I thought, oh, that looks interesting. And then I looked at the dates. I'm like, holy crap! I got to reschedule my week next week because I'm going to this thing. So I had absolutely no prep time whatsoever going in, which I think made it kind of fun too, because I kind of just showed up and hung out and didn't know what I was really wanting to look for. So it kind of worked out really well that I kind of fell into it backwards and really enjoyed myself. Okay, so just touching on a couple of things that they had in the keynote on the next slide. This was something, I kind of came away from the whole thing that it didn't have the polish of your typical IBM conference or Microsoft conference that you might be used to or comfortable with. And in a lot of ways, that was a good thing. Like I kind of stood back at certain points and I'm like, okay, they're stumbling around a little bit, but at the same time, they had an awesome panel that I'll talk about coming up here in a couple of slides. And you could tell it was not scripted at all. They had a couple of topics that they wanted to talk about, but whoever wanted to talked. And that is so very much unlike your typical IBM conference where everybody is scripted. So I really quite enjoyed that. Anyway, with this particular slide where they're talking about 8.8 million instances of Node, he kind of threw out the stats. This was the chairman of the Node Foundation was speaking at this point. And I couldn't get a real sense of whether these were impressive stats or not. I took away that they are impressive, but of course, not really living in the Node world. This was something that I was coming just to learn and see what the whole thing was about. I didn't have context, which was something that I would have hoped for in this slide, like saying, compared to last year, this is how much growth we've seen, et cetera, et cetera. And yet at the same time, I love the middle stat here, 3 billion NodeJS packages downloaded per week from NPM. I mean, on anybody's measuring stick, that's a pretty impressive stat. So that was one of the things that we took away. Moving to the next
staggering.
slide. It really is, and again, I came in, I've done some training on Node. I've done a little bit of programming. I've certainly seen some presentations in the ICS world that talk about Node and talk about how nodes and domino and connections can, maybe take advantage of those tools and technology. And so that was one of my goals going into this thing, was to just see, what are people talking about? How do they think? And then try and bridge that gap into the ICS world. So to come in without sort of any real context of the Node world, some of it was pretty fresh to me. Some of it was completely over my head. But I agree, 3 billion downloads per week is that's a staggering number. Anyway, with the next slide, I really love this one because it splashes up from some pretty awesome names. And this was obviously somebody's photo from Twitter while the presentation was going on. But they highlighted Netflix in particular and said that Netflix has more or less transitioned the massive amount of their infrastructure to run on Node, which I think can hit home for everybody, because I'm reasonably sure that most people, I was a late adopter to Netflix, so I'm pretty sure everybody's using Netflix. And to see how Netflix works and how responsive it is and all of that, and then to know that it's running on open source software is a pretty impressive thing. Okay, moving on to the next slide. I already mentioned this quickly, the sponsors, Google, IBM, there were a couple of vendors. There were only a handful of sponsors. There was probably under 1,000 people at this conference. It wasn't a lot of people. They had 3 sessions going at the same time, not the typical, 10, 20, 30 at a time that we're used to with the larger IBM conferences. So not a huge amount of people, not a huge amount of sponsors, but the key players were there. NPM was there, and I've got a neat slide at the end that shows one of the unique things that they were doing that just shows how community-minded they are. Sessions were 30 minutes, lots of young people. I definitely felt like an old guy there, but of course I was there to learn new tricks, so it felt good. Certainly it had a similar feel to Lotusphere, and of course I was coming in as an outsider, so just to kind of watch the interaction and the community building that they were doing, the availability of people like the chairman, everybody that had anything to do with sort of the organization of the conference, they were all available. You could go up and talk to them at any time. It was pretty cool. Like I said, it wasn't an IBM conference, meaning that it didn't have that polish, yet at the same time, you know, there were a lot of similarities.
How many attendees were there?
Yeah, about 1,000, maybe 900. I sat at the front of the room for the opening session, and when I turned around, it was reasonably full. And I did a count later on that it could have held about 1,000 people, and not every seat was full. So, you know, somewhere 900. They said that their goal for next year is to double their numbers. So that's a reasonable goal, I think. I did want to point out that of some of the sessions that I saw, I saw one that had nothing but emojis. Every slide had an emoji on it. And I was just like, wow, there's a slightly different approach, a slightly younger approach to how the content was being presented. I saw another one, in fact, quite a very good presentation that I'll talk about in a little bit, that had animated GIFs on every single slide. I think back to some of the controversy of Lotusphere's past, where IBM is pretty sticky about copyrighted images. There was none of that here. There was copyrighted images. There was content on there that I thought, okay, we wouldn't be seeing this at an IBM conference. And one presentation in particular that I saw, where there was a guy that was F-bombing left, right, center, right through the whole thing. And when I heard the first one, I went, did I just hear that? And then the second one came, I'm like, okay, this is completely different from what I'm used to at an IBM conference. Anyway, I quite enjoyed myself.
You mean the formal conference track, not the unofficial birds of a feather that's not scheduled and happens at the pub, right?
This room was full. It was one of the regulars, yeah, for sure. So this is the slide that I was mentioning earlier about the roundtable that was at the opening session. And that was just wonderful. It was unscripted. It actually went over time. For women in technology who all play a significant role in the Node Foundation. And the woman that's just left of center is an IBMer. Two others there are with the Node Foundation, and the young lady that's on the outside right is from Microsoft. She's actually a maintainer of one of the modules that's fairly well used, and does it on her own time. And this is just the kind of the neat sentiment of one of the topics that they discussed, where they said it's Open Source Friday, and give yourself permission to contribute to it. So where they're basically saying how this is open source, and you're not sure whether you should actually be you know, making the contribution or spending the time, or is anybody ever using my code? They're like, yes, they are, and we love to see contributions, and give yourself permission to do it. You know, I think this is a sense of what you might call imposter syndrome, where people think that you know, they're not allowed, not capable, not worthy to make some kind of a contribution. And these guys are saying, you know what, we all rely on each other, we all support each other, we've got each other's backs, and yeah, if you've got time, absolutely give yourself permission. Nobody's going to tell you to, and you don't have to ask anybody. Just go out there and do it. It was a really wonderful sentiment, and a really powerful presentation by these people. I really quite enjoyed it. So moving on to why did I attend? Well, as we already said, I was in Vancouver and the timing worked, so I jumped in with both feet and thought, I'm going to go see what I can learn. And you know, especially going to a conference where I'm not necessarily, you know, I'm stepping out of my comfort zone. I'm not necessarily really up on the technology. And this is even true of Lotusphere, to be perfectly honest. When you go, you're not necessarily going to learn stuff. You're going to learn what you need to go and learn. So I was really going to talk to people and say, hey, I'm coming from this world. I'm very interested in your world. I'm really interested in figuring out how we can branch from one to the other. And so I want to try and drink from the fire hose, as it were, and just try and learn as much as I can. And so that was really, you know, my goal of going. But of course, the other reason is from the recent past, in the last year and maybe a bit, seeing sessions at Lotusphere, and certainly the conversations around Connections Pink using Node, it's a part of our world in ICS that we need to be more familiar with. So that was another reason why I wanted to go. Um, Moving on to who did I meet? So, one of the things that I tried to do, I was kind of naturally drawn to the IBM content. And I found myself partway through as I was looking at what are the different presentations and stuff like that, and who are the presenters. And of course, just being in the IBM world, that jumped out at me a lot. And I thought, no, you know what? I really need to go and hear what Google is saying about things. I need to go and hear what Microsoft is saying about things. What are all the different vendors doing? What are people talking about? So I made a point of not necessarily going to see every IBM presentation that there was there. But at the same time, I made a point of introducing myself to the IBMers and learning who they were, and even to some of them saying, yeah, I'm an IBM Domino ICS champion. And they're like, oh, Notes, yeah, okay, we use that. And I said, what do you use it for? And they're like, well, we use it for our email. And I go, okay, but there's other stuff that you can do. And so that was where I engaged them in the conversation to say, all right, here's how I would do something like this. How would you do something like this? And where can we meet in the middle? So that was part of it. Anyway, two of the key people that I met there were Michael Dawson and Erin McKean. Erin, as I said, was on that front panel. She's just got some wonderful, wonderful ideas. Michael, however, interestingly enough, he is kind of the lead for IBM in the Node world. IBM has 10 people working full-time, contributing open source software to Node projects. Now, as it turns out, they're using that code internally for IBM projects, in particular Pink. But these are not ICS folks, so I don't want to say that there's only 10 people working on Pink, because I know there's hundreds of people working on Pink. There are 10 people who are specifically working on open source for the Node Foundation, and Michael is one of those and kind of leading that. And Michael happens to be in Ottawa, so we have a Canadian who's very centrally involved in Node within IBM, and I met several others, Vancouver-based guy, some other folks from around the world. But I also had the chance to talk to Erin here. And Erin, she's from San Francisco. As it says here, she's a developer advocate specific to Node, been doing JavaScript for a long, long time, gave a presentation that I unfortunately missed, but was very well received just around arrays in JavaScript. So anyway, those were a couple of folks. I met lots of people at the IBM table. But then I also ended up speaking to some others, one of which was this Vancouver-based young man who he's working on the Loopback team. So Loopback is a package that IBM is contributing to Node, and it's basically an API generation tool. It gives you the ability to do like REST API calls and stuff like that. And I'm very much oversimplifying it. Because I don't even understand it. This is one of those things on my list of stuff to go and learn. But anyway, he's Vancouver-based. A lot of the Loopback team is actually based in Toronto, interestingly enough. So of this small select group of IBMers that's doing a lot of stuff with Node, it's interesting that quite a number of them are Canadians. The funny thing about this, though, he was a reasonably young guy. When we were just exchanging contact information, and as I hand him my card, he goes, I don't have my cards. I'm like, yeah, okay, no problem. What's your email address? And he goes, are you on GitHub? And he goes, I said, yeah. And he goes, okay, here's my GitHub account. And that was it. He didn't give me a card. He didn't give me an email address. He just said, you can find me on GitHub. Get in touch with me there. So I thought that was pretty cool. As I mentioned before, the organizers were very available and engaging, available to talk to other members of the Node Foundation. They were all there and all available. And I made a point of talking to all the vendors too. So I talked to the Microsoft guys, and Heroku was there, and NPM, and then a few smaller players that had specific tools, including, interestingly enough, one that had a pay package that you would install inside your Node environment that looks for security attacks from inside your application. And this was where I was having a hard time kind of bridging the gap to, okay, so I've got a Domino server, and that Domino server has an HTTP stack, an SMTP stack, and a directory, and all kinds of security. In fact, I had a conversation, I was explaining it to one of the young Microsoft guys that was there, and he goes, that sounds like a security nightmare. And I just started laughing at him. I said, listen, man, we've been doing this for a long time. Again, it was, like I say, it was going and trying to see what this new world is, and there was a certain amount of, okay, that's cool, and that's something that I really need to learn about. And then there was a certain amount of skepticism where I'm like, I've been doing this for a while. Why would I go and rewrite all of this stuff? Because I've already got it out of the box. So that's part of what I still need to do is my education. Anyway,
Well, as a front-end developer, I mean, even it doesn't matter what your back end is in. If you're doing any front-end development now, Node is incredibly useful because of the tooling that it brings to bear. So a lot of command line stuff with Node for builds and tooling and like a lot.
absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. I have just to do a shout out to John Jardine. I saw one of his presentations at Connect last year where he was talking about a React front end that he built, and I'm like, okay, I got to go learn how to do that, because he took the JS file and he put it right onto the Domino server, and off he went, and his whole React application ran right on top of the Domino server. So this stuff is possible. We just got to go out and learn how to do it. Anyway, not wanting to take a long time here, but some other things. Let's move into the takeaways. So, open source. There was a wonderful, wonderful presentation at the beginning by Google, and in fact, Google had several different presentations. Google's got a team in Germany that's doing a lot of work. Their V8 tool, which is kind of the central core engine inside of Chrome, and they made an announcement here where they're not allowing commits to V8 to land if it breaks something in Node, which is kind of powerful when you think
That's
about it.
awesome.
Yeah, it was really cool and very well received. The crowd gave them lots of cheers. So they more or less stood up and said, listen, we're not going to proceed with our code if it breaks your code, which I thought was pretty cool, because again, this is open source. This isn't necessarily anybody that's paying for it. So I found that really, really powerful. So JavaScript, there was just a quick conversation, and anybody that knows me knows that I'm an old school Notes to Domino guy. I've been doing lots of LotusScript stuff and maybe a little bit of JavaScript stuff, and as it turns out, getting into the Java world, have been for a few years now. But there was a slide here that just talked about JavaScript and the use of JavaScript, and this was something that was just some stats off of GitHub and Stack Overflow. That top blue line, you can probably guess, is the use of JavaScript. So it's just almost by double the most used language that's out there on the internet today. So there was certainly lots of love. Now, of course, it was a Node conference, so they're
on
all
GitHub, right? Specific to GitHub.
Exactly. Yeah. So
if I'm not mistaken, Java's got the most code in it, but
yeah,
I could certainly see GitHub having more JavaScript than anything.
as I say, they were patting each other on the back, and not that that was a bad thing, right? That was what they were there for. So that was fine. But anyways, some of the things that I saw, some of the presentations that I saw, Visual Studio Code, I saw a Microsoft guy get up and give the fastest presentation I have ever seen. He had 30 minutes, and he probably packed in about an hour and a half worth of stuff to talk about Visual Studio Code as an editor, and showed just some insanely cool stuff.
I love VS Code. It's awesome.
Oh, and the thing that he showed that just took me, it was the first thing that he showed. He actually had a package that was in his application. He went to his hard drive. He deleted the folder that had that particular package in it. He went back to VS Code and retyped the line in his code, require, and whatever the package name was. And by the time he hit enter and went back to his hard drive, VS Code had downloaded that package off the internet and installed it on his computer, which I was just absolutely blown away by. Showed a ton of other stuff that was really cool. So again, I'm probably late to the game here, but Visual Studio Code is a pretty awesome. I said to my wife, actually, who I met at technical school 20-something years ago, I said, imagine if we had an editor like that back then. It would just made things so much easier. Anyway, a couple of other things quickly. Serverless was a topic of conversation. This probably could take up an hour or more. I saw actually 3 presentations back to back to back on this one. Serverless, the idea here is that you write your code and you put just a specific function into the cloud. And in this one particular presentation that I saw first, she had, if you search on GitHub for some code called Beatlemania, that was her demo. And what she had was a section of code named after each of the Beatles, and each was intended to run on one of either Amazon Web Services, Google's cloud, Microsoft's cloud, or IBM's cloud. And the code it was just a simple function that went off and pulled back the name of a Beatles song. But what she was illustrating is that you can write this code and you can put it on any one of those cloud services and have that function just do a really small, distinct piece of functionality and return something back. And then you can call a function on a different cloud service and a different cloud service. And that was more or less what her her call, or the point of her presentation was that you don't need to have this on a specific server. You can use functions as a service, but you don't have to marry yourself to any one of the particular vendors. So that, again, something that I found very interesting. GraphQL is something that's been discussed. Certainly Paul Withers and others at Red Pill have talked about that in the IBM world, in the Domino world. I saw some presentations by customers who were actually using this. Trying to remember the name, bustle.com. I saw a couple of presentations by that group, including one that was talking about GraphQL and using it as kind of the next thing after REST APIs. It was almost like there was this sentiment in the conference that was like, oh yeah, REST APIs are so 2016. Anybody who's anybody should be using GraphQL now, which was quite entertaining.
Well, if your REST API is going to return an Atom feed, which is an XML document this big, and you want this one string this big out of it, GraphQL, a little bit more concise and easier.
It was certainly interesting, and especially some of the samples that they were talking about was really, really cool to see. And the last key takeaway I'd already mentioned, there were certain things where you hear these guys who were like, oh wow, this is really great and stuff, and I'm like, yeah, man, I've been doing that in Domino for a while. And of course, I remember when I was really young and was like, oh, there's this really cool function that I just figured out. And of course, I'm talking to guys that have been working on code on mainframes for years, and they're like, yeah, we've been doing that for a while. So, everything that's old is new again. We saw it all over anyway. Okay, next slide. So one other thing from the key takeaways, and this was really, really cool. The title of the guy's talk was the roadmap for NodeJS. And he got up there in one sentence, he said, gang, there's no roadmap for NodeJS. It's open source. It's whatever people want to contribute. We've got a list of things that people would like to see, but if we've got nobody to write that code, it's not going to get done. And if you want to pick something that you want to do and contribute, awesome. We love it. So it was really, really interesting. You know how, right, Colin, we've been to IBM conferences where we're like, you got to do this in Notes, and how come you haven't done this yet, and et cetera, and on and on and on. And Ed Brill and others get up there and say, yeah, it's on the roadmap, and we're wanting to get to it, and so on. These guys are like, yeah, whatever, if you want to do it, pull down, fork the code and write it yourself. We'd love to have you.
We don't need to pour gasoline on that fire.
I don't think we do. Okay, just wrapping up here. So this was kind of cool. I mentioned the NPM booth. They actually were raising money for PADS, which is puppies, assistance puppies. And so they actually had 2 or 3 or 4 dogs at their booth during the day, and we're really giving a lot of love to the organization that was running things. And so, of course, there's this massive huddle around these puppies. And, I think we've all been to conferences where we just work and go and attend and do things and stuff like that. And so these dogs were here just, giving off some love and giving people a chance to sort of recharge their batteries and carry on. I just thought it was really cool. And finally, stickers. This is me talking to Michael, and again, anybody that knows me knows I like to put a Canada sticker on my badge. So I was sharing the stickers, but this is again kind of the youngness and the hipness of this crowd. There were stickers. Every vendor had stickers to give away. You could pick up stickers to stick on your laptop, and of course that's sort of one of the things that I think we've seen of sort of the younger generation, is that they're happy to throw stickers on their laptop. So that was what. There we go. Yeah, no kidding. I've got a C3UG sticker on my laptop. So anyway,
I should really have one of those on mine.
You probably should. Yes.
Why don't I have a C3UG sticker?
They were at Connect last
I know.
time.
I know. I was handing them out. Why didn't I put one on my own laptop? Shame on me.
That's right. Anyway, why don't you go ahead and wrap up? We're on the last slide here.
Yeah. So I think it's really important that our community engage with us. One thing, YouTube isn't giving notifications unless somebody's got a monster channel now. And given that we're pretty niche focused, we're certainly not a monster channel by YouTube standards, pretty modest viewership. But what you need to do is both subscribe and click the little bell icon to the right of the subscribe button. So if you're already subscribed, you'll have a bell. The bell will change after you click on it, and then you're more likely to get notified when a new video is put up. If you have questions, the c3ug.ca website, where we will post this video, you'll be able to post questions there so that others can benefit.